Oakland, 1964. A 6th-degree judo black belt, 38 years old, walks into a basement training hall expecting to make an example of a 23-year-old Chinese instructor who's been making claims no martial artist should make. The judo champion has thrown Olympic hopefuls. He's trained with the Kodokan elite in Tokyo. He weighs 215 pounds and has never been taken down by anyone under a brown belt. 5 seconds later, he's on his back, staring at the ceiling, unable to explain what just happened to his body. This is that story. Bruce Lee wasn't famous yet. He had no movies, no international following, just a small school on Broadway Street in Oakland where he taught a fighting system most people had never heard of. He called it Jeet Kune Do, but back then it was just a collection of ideas that made traditional masters uncomfortable. Lee believed most martial arts were too rigid, too ceremonial, too detached from the violence they claimed to address. He said this openly. He said it in demonstrations. He said it in ways that made people want to prove him wrong. The judo champion, his name appears in only 2 private accounts, never confirmed publicly, heard about Lee through a mutual acquaintance. Someone who'd seen Lee spar. Someone who said Lee was fast, unconventional, and arrogant. The champion didn't like arrogance. He'd spent 2 decades perfecting throws that required timing, leverage, and an understanding of balance that took years to develop. He'd seen plenty of young strikers who thought speed could replace technique. He wanted to teach this one a lesson. According to those present, the meeting was arranged informally. No cameras. No referees. Just a handful of students sitting along the walls of Lee's school, watching 2 men size each other up in the center of a worn wooden floor. The judo champion wore his GI. Lee wore black slacks and a plain shirt. He didn't bow. He didn't assume a formal stance. He just stood there, hands low, weight centered, eyes fixed on the other man's shoulders. The champion moved first. He stepped in with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, reaching for Lee's collar and sleeve to establish a grip. In judo, the grip is everything. Control the fabric, control the body. Control the body, control the fight. It's a system built on this principle. The champion's hands were fast, practiced, efficient. They never touched Lee. What happened next depends on who you ask. One student said Lee slapped the champion's hands away and drove a palm into his chest so hard it sounded like a drum. Another said Lee stepped offline and swept the champion's lead leg while striking his jaw simultaneously. A third account, written years later in a private letter, describes Lee moving in a way that seemed to bypass the space between them entirely, one moment standing, the next moment inside the champion's reach, too close to grab, too fast to counter. What every witness agrees on is this: the judo champion went down. Hard. Fast. With no chance to break his fall the way judo practitioners are trained to do. He landed flat on his back, wind gone, eyes wide, and for a moment the room was completely silent. Lee didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just extended a hand and asked if the man was all right. The champion took the hand. He got up slowly, adjusted his GI, and nodded once. Then he left. He didn't say anything to the students. He didn't ask for a second round. He walked out of the school and, according to later accounts, never spoke publicly about what happened that day. But that wasn't what unsettled the witnesses. What unsettled them was the expression on Lee's face during the exchange. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't anger. It was focus so complete it looked like indifference. As if the entire encounter had been a simple demonstration of physics. As if the outcome had never been in question. Lee's students began asking him about it afterward. They wanted to know what technique he'd used, what opening he'd seen, what principle had made the difference. Lee's answer, recorded in one student's journal, was frustratingly simple: he committed to a movement that didn't account for what I could do before he finished it. This answer reveals everything about Lee's approach. He didn't see martial arts as a series of techniques to memorize and deploy. He saw them as a study of human reaction time, body mechanics, and the gaps between intention and execution. He trained to exploit those gaps. He trained to move in ways that disrupted the rhythm his opponents relied on. And he trained to hit with a kind of precision that felt, to those on the receiving end, less like violence and more like being caught in machinery. The judo champion had walked in expecting a grappling match. He'd expected to control distance, establish grips, and use his weight advantage to dominate a smaller man. What he encountered instead was someone who refused to fight on those terms. Lee didn't try to out-grapple him. He didn't try to match strength with strength. He simply removed the conditions that made judo effective. Later accounts suggest the champion returned to his own school and began incorporating striking defense into his training. He never challenged Lee again. He never denied what happened. He just stopped talking about it. This wasn't the first time Lee had dismantled a credentialed martial artist. It wouldn't be the last. But this encounter became significant because of what it represented. Here was a decorated judoka, someone with decades of training and competition experience, someone who understood leverage and balance at the highest level, rendered completely ineffective in under 5 seconds by a man who wasn't even famous yet. The story circulated quietly. Lee's reputation grew, but not in the way traditional martial artists wanted. He wasn't seen as a master in the classical sense. He was seen as dangerous. Unpredictable. Someone who didn't respect the unwritten rules that governed martial arts culture in the 1960s. Those rules said you honored your opponent's style. You gave them a chance to demonstrate their skill. You fought within a shared framework that allowed both sides to save face. Lee didn't care about any of that. Almost no one noticed what changed in that moment. Before the encounter, Lee's students saw him as skilled. After, they saw him as something else. They began training differently. They stopped thinking about techniques as isolated movements and started thinking about them as responses to specific problems. They stopped asking how do I throw a punch, and started asking what prevents my punch from landing. This shift, from technique-focused training to problem-focused training, became the foundation of Jeet Kune Do. Lee's notes from this period, now archived and studied by martial arts historians, show an obsession with efficiency. He measured everything. Reaction time. Footwork angles. Impact force. He treated fighting like engineering. Every movement had to justify its existence. If a technique required more time or energy than an alternative, it was discarded. If a stance limited mobility, it was modified. If a tradition couldn't explain its purpose in practical terms, it was abandoned. This approach made him enemies. Traditional masters saw it as disrespectful. They argued that martial arts were about more than just winning fights. They were about discipline, culture, philosophy, lineage. Lee didn't disagree. He just didn't think those things should come at the expense of effectiveness. He believed a martial art that couldn't adapt to real violence was a performance art, not a fighting system. The judo champion, in his silence, seemed to agree. There's a detail in one of the witness accounts that rarely gets mentioned. After the champion left, Lee sat down on the floor and stretched for 20 minutes without saying a word. His students waited, unsure if they should ask questions or leave him alone. Finally, one of them asked if Lee had been worried before the match. Lee looked up, surprised by the question, and said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. I wasn't worried about beating him. I was worried about explaining why it worked. This distinction reveals the complexity of Lee's thinking. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a teacher trying to systematize instincts that most martial artists developed unconsciously over decades. He was trying to make the invisible visible. To break down moments that happen too fast for deliberate thought and turn them into principles that could be taught, tested, and refined. The problem was that most people didn't want principles. They wanted techniques. They wanted to learn the move Bruce Lee used so they could replicate it. But Lee knew that wasn't how it worked. The move only worked because of the setup. The setup only worked because of the timing. The timing only worked because of thousands of hours spent training reactions until they became automatic. You can't teach that in an afternoon. You can't even teach it in a year. The judo champion understood this, whether he admitted it or not. He'd spent 20 years mastering a system that worked beautifully within its own rules. But those rules assumed both fighters agreed to play the same game. Lee didn't agree. He played a different game entirely, one where the first person to impose their framework won. This is why the encounter lasted 5 seconds. Not because Lee was overwhelmingly stronger or faster, but because he removed the conditions that would have allowed a longer fight. He didn't give the champion time to establish grips. He didn't give him space to set up throws. He didn't give him the opportunity to use any of the skills that had taken decades to develop. In later years, sports scientists would study this concept under the term restrictive combat strategy. The idea is simple: instead of trying to be better than your opponent at everything, you engineer situations where their strengths become irrelevant. Lee didn't invent this idea, but he understood it better than almost anyone in his era. And he had the speed, timing, and precision to execute it against world-class opponents. The judo champion's silence after the encounter speaks volumes. He didn't claim he'd been caught off guard. He didn't ask for a rematch under different conditions. He simply acknowledged, through his actions, that he'd encountered something outside his understanding. And rather than deny it or diminish it, he absorbed the lesson and moved on. This kind of humility is rare, especially among high-level martial artists. The ego required to reach 6th degree black belt in any discipline is immense. You have to believe, on some level, that your system is superior. That your training has prepared you for anything. When that belief is shattered in 5 seconds, the psychological impact can be devastating. But that wasn't what unsettled Lee. What unsettled Lee, according to his private writings from that period, was how easily it had happened. He'd expected more resistance. He'd expected the champion to adapt, to adjust, to force him into deeper exchanges. The fact that it ended so quickly bothered him because it suggested most martial artists, even highly ranked ones, were training for a kind of fight that didn't actually exist. They were training for matches with rules. For opponents who fought the same way they did. For scenarios where both sides had time to demonstrate skill. Lee believed real violence didn't look like that. Real violence was chaotic, sudden, and over before most people realized it had started. Training had to reflect that reality, or it was just choreography. This philosophy would eventually make him famous. But in 1964, it just made him isolated. He had students, but few peers. He had respect from some circles, but hostility from others. He was building something new in a world that didn't want new. It wanted tradition. It wanted lineage. It wanted proof that the old ways still worked. The judo champion, lying on his back in a basement in Oakland, was proof that they didn't. The aftermath of the encounter spread slowly. There were no viral videos. No instant replays. Just word of mouth among a small community of martial artists in the Bay Area who'd heard that something strange had happened at Bruce Lee's school. Some dismissed it. Some embellished it. Some investigated it by visiting Lee themselves. Those who visited usually left with the same expression the judo champion had: quiet, thoughtful, and reluctant to describe what they'd experienced. Lee's school didn't grow explosively after the encounter. His reputation did. And with that reputation came challenges. More martial artists wanting to test him. More skeptics wanting to prove he was a fraud. More attention from people who didn't understand that what he was teaching couldn't be measured by traditional standards. He faced them all. Some lasted longer than 5 seconds. None of them left unchanged. Years later, after Lee became famous, a journalist asked him if he remembered the judo champion. Lee paused, as if sorting through dozens of similar memories, then nodded. The journalist asked if he regretted how quickly the match had ended. If he wished he'd given the man more of a chance. Lee's answer was immediate. Giving someone a chance in a real fight is how you lose. I showed him the truth. What he did with it was his choice. The judo champion never spoke about it. But his students noticed changes in his teaching. He started emphasizing adaptability over adherence to form. He started training them to fight opponents who didn't follow judo rules. He started, in small ways, teaching the lesson Bruce Lee had given him in 5 seconds. That might be the real legacy of the encounter. Not the humiliation. Not the speed. But the quiet acknowledgement, from one master to another, that the truth about fighting is harder and simpler than any tradition wants to admit. You can spend 20 years perfecting a system. But if someone moves in a way your system doesn't account for, those 20 years disappear. Bruce Lee understood this. The judo champion learned it. And somewhere in a basement in Oakland, on a worn wooden floor, the old rules stopped applying.